It's been a while since we've done a video with The Notebook. So let's do a video with The Notebook. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny came out a couple years ago and did not do great in the box office, which, given its pretty ridiculous budget, is pretty rough. Which I guess works out, given it's meant to be the last movie in the franchise. Except the ending doesn't really say that. But the movie got a lot of criticism when it came out. And I didn't watch it at the time because I was hit with franchise fatigue. I wasn't watching a whole lot of franchise stuff. I was just kind of like, I'll get around to it eventually, despite loving the Indiana Jones franchise. It's one that I grew up on, so to me there's a lot of sentimental value, you know, being a kid and watching Raiders of the Lost Ark for the first time with my dad. I think that this movie captures that better than Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, but I'm going to do a separate video on that. So after watching it, for a video that I'm working on the main channel over here, I was wondering what were the criticisms that people had that led to such a negative reaction in the public to me going into the movie expecting it to be really bad because that's what I had heard. But I came out of the movie actually quite happy with it, except for the ending, but we'll talk about that later. This video is going to have 3 sections. One is talking about the criticisms that the general public seem to have with this movie. 2, my issues with the Dial of Destiny that I haven't heard other people bring up. And then also my praises, because overall, I actually really enjoyed this movie. I don't fully understand why it got flamed so hard when it came out, but let's get into that. So let's start off with the criticisms that I think are the most valid, the ones that I've heard around that after watching it, I was like, yeah, that's pretty fair. And the biggest one that I saw was that the runtime is long. And a long runtime is not necessarily a bad thing, but when the movie feels padded to reach that runtime, that is bad. And I do feel like the Dial of Destiny has a good bit of padding. There's a lot of chase sequences that A, are very CGI heavy and it's obvious, but B, just feel like they go on for way longer than they need to. And given that the movie is 2 hours and 40 minutes, something like that, you feel it. It adds up. And I guess in that vein, a lot of people saying that this movie does feel like a series of chase sequences tied together very loosely with story. And I would say, yeah, that's a pretty valid criticism, particularly when you look at the older Indiana Jones movies and you don't necessarily have this level of globe trotting. They're a lot more focused. Sometimes there's a lot of travel right at the start, but once you get into the thick of it, it's pretty streamlined. It's usually pretty focused, but this movie does hop around to a bunch of different locations. We've got Morocco, Germany, Syracuse, New York, a couple of other places that I don't remember. There's a lot of hopping around, and I don't think it's that detrimental to the movie. I think they're connected together well enough that it didn't bother me when I was watching it. Writing out Shia LaBeouf's character, Mutt, from the previous movie sucks. He's one of the good parts about Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Now I understand why they did this. Shia LaBeouf is not exactly in Hollywood's good books at the moment, so I'm not terribly surprised that Disney was like, we don't want to touch that. Also, recasting is a thing, especially when this movie is 20-ish years after Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. I think a recasting would be less obvious than if it was, like a year afterwards and you're like, that's definitely not Shia LaBeouf a year later. And then probably one of the bigger ones, the digital de-aging, which looks reasonably good, still has that little bit of lifelessness in the eyes where you can tell it's not Harrison Ford's actual face, but it is the best one that I have seen. But it is a little bit more glaring when you hear 80-whatever-year-old Harrison Ford's voice coming out of what I think is meant to be like 30-year-old Harrison Ford's face.
You got a lot of nice stuff.
It does take you out of it a little bit, but I think overall the effect was pretty good. I think the only other time that it really jumped out was in some of the wide shots where you see Indy running and he's running like an 80-year-old. Like this, it's not quite as bad as like with The Irishman, and you've got Robert De Niro kicking the dude on the street. You can tell. It's definitely not to that degree, but it is still there. Overall, those criticisms I all think are pretty reasonable. Definitely not immersion breaking, didn't ruin the movie, but I think they're all things that I wouldn't fault someone for having this issue with the movie. And if you don't like the movie because of it, I don't agree with that, but I can understand it. But let's get on to the bad criticisms, the ones that I think are made in bad faith or are just bad criticisms, like you're intentionally missing information to make the point you're trying to make. Big one, and I think a lot of this comes from the woke brigade sort of shit. Wombat, who's played by Phoebe Waller-Bridge, is annoyingly arrogant. She's a Mary Sue. No, it's established very early in the movie that Wombat looked up to Indy as a role model of sorts when she was young.
The final triumph. Indiana Jones, out with a bang, back in the saddle.
But the last time that she saw Indiana Jones, she was like 9.
I was 12 years old.
So obviously she's grown up with this image of Indy that is obviously not aligned with, I assume she's meant to be in her late 20s in this movie. So 20 years later, that's not the same person that she idolized as a child, but she's grown up with that image. And so a lot of that comes through, and it mirrors a lot of young Indiana Jones. The arrogance, the charm, the bit of selfishness, it all makes sense. Now, obviously, I can't tell you whether you're right or wrong to find her character annoying. That is down to a personal preference thing. But coming from a narrative writing perspective, where, you could write a character to intentionally be annoying, I don't think that was the case. I don't think that Mangold and whoever else ended up writing this intentionally wrote Wombat to be annoying. And in the final product, I don't think that she comes across as annoying either. I don't agree with that criticism. But I do like that they establish, because there are elements in the same way that like Mutt has elements of a young Indiana Jones, but twisted in a different way so that they clash with Indy more than like old Indy versus young Indy would, right? And I think the thing that really encapsulates this is Wombat's cheering.
When you're in a tight spot, dynamite.
And then he's like, what are you doing?
My friend was just murdered.
And it brings it back down to reality. And I think that sort of reality check, the balancing of, yeah, okay, you've got old grumpy Indiana Jones and then young reckless Wombat, and they butt heads. And I guess that's kind of tying right into the next criticism I heard a lot of, which is, why do they fight so much when they have a shared goal? Say you and your best friend want to take over the world, and you want to do it via achieving world peace, and your friend wants to do it by killing everyone. Obviously, despite both wanting to take over the world, you have very different attitudes about what that looks like, how to achieve that. And so obviously, despite your similar goal that you are both set out to achieve, you're going to butt heads over how to achieve it. This is a very common storytelling trope, and I don't understand how common this criticism is, because it seems like you didn't watch the movie, which I don't like saying that as a criticism, but genuinely, the conflict between the two isn't over the goal. They're not butting heads because they want conflicting things. They want the same thing, but they're butting heads because they don't agree on how to achieve that thing. Especially when you consider Indy doesn't want to be on this adventure. He feels like he's been forced, well, he kind of has been forced into it because he's been framed for murder and he needs to clear his name. It's a little bit different when you've got old man here to clear his name versus young woman here to make some money. Even though ultimately they're looking for the same artifact, they want to stop the Nazi from getting it. Like, yeah, they've got those shared goals. Clearly their motivations behind those goals and then their approach to those goals are going to be different, and they butt heads. And I think it also really works for the character development of, despite them not agreeing on a lot of stuff, they rub off on each other. They chip away at each other's attitudes, and we see that in the movie. Like when they're walking through the cave of Dionysius, and Indy makes some remark about Wombat really not being that selfish because she's got her little sidekick with her, and the story of how they met had heart to it. It wasn't just, yeah, he's ultimately profitable for the business, right?
Where'd you find her?
We tried to steal my purse outside a casino in Marrakesh when he was 10. I hit him repeatedly with my car door, but he didn't let go, and neither did I, so...
Thought you were all about the money.
I am.
Nobody memorizes every page of their dead father's notebooks. For the money.
Yeah, there's little bits of Indy like chipping away at that and shattering that bad bitch persona, as it were. And in the same way, it goes the other direction of Indy not really wanting to be on this adventure, but the adventure that he's been forced on, bringing out a little bit of that younger Indiana Jones. And I think that they work as good, both foils and complements to each other. But let's get on to my criticisms, ones that I haven't seen anywhere else. I haven't done like a ton of digging, but realistically, I went through my subscriptions and I watched every movie commentator that I watched that has done a video on this movie. I went through, and a lot of the criticisms were the same. But I didn't see this one, which is Mads Mikkelsen as Jürgen Voller is good, but it just feels like every time Mads Mikkelsen is cast as a villain, he's kind of the same stoic, little bit detached from reality European that he always is. It feels like he's always playing kind of the same character. And so despite this performance being good, I don't think it was particularly interesting. I don't feel like I got anything new out of it. Is this maybe nitpicky? Yeah, I guess. It wasn't like it ruined the movie for me. It was just a little thing that bothered me of like every time I've seen Mads Mikkelsen on screen the last couple of years, it just feels like he's doing the same thing. And obviously, given that James Mangold directed this, probably not surprising that some of this looks very distinctly James Mangold. And that's not a bad thing. I like Mangold's style. But what really stood out to me was the New York parade scene. After a bunch of people have been shot at the university, Indy's on the run from the Nazis and the CIA. I guess that's another criticism, though. The CIA plotline doesn't go anywhere. Just literally gets shot dead. But in that sequence, the city is very clearly a digital set extension, which is completely reasonable. In this day and age, that's just how production goes. But if you compare this shot, just look at the buildings, right? And you can tell they're digital. And then look at this shot from the Wolverine. It's a very James Mangold shot. I just feel like in a lot of his work, cities are shown this way. Not strictly a bad thing, but it doesn't feel very Indiana Jones. And I think that's kind of my gripe with a lot of the outside sequences. I think a lot of the indoor sequences, particularly like in the university when I was lecturing, in the bar with Wombat, in the archives of the university, those all felt pretty Indiana Jones. Modernized a little bit, but the way that they were lit, which was dramatic, but still mostly naturalistic, felt very Indiana Jones to me. Versus a lot of the exterior sequences don't. Like, compare this sequence from Raiders of the Lost Ark and this sequence in Morocco, and you can tell they're not really shot with the same attitudes. Obviously, cinema has come a long way from the original, Raiders is 1981, I think? Yeah, and going from the original Raiders to 2025 now, cinema's changed massively. But I feel like even 2008's Kingdom of the Crystal Skull nailed it feeling like an Indiana Jones movie in a stylistic sense better. Not all the time, particularly the second half. I'm going to do a separate video on that movie because, it's better and worse than I remember. But yeah, there was a lot of stuff that stylistically I was like, this doesn't look and feel like an Indiana Jones movie. It feels like a James Mangold movie, which isn't a bad thing, but not necessarily what I would want out of an Indiana Jones movie. Anyway, moving on. The other digital set extension and sky replacement that was really obvious is all the stuff in the Siege of Syracuse, which obviously they had to do a lot of that digitally. Not surprised by that. But even there's a couple of sky replacements where it's just them on a hill. It's facing away from the city that's being sieged. And it's so obvious. It was really glaring. That did take me out of it a little bit. And like I said, with the CIA plotline being shot dead, the whole Indy being framed for murder thing also shot dead with the CIA lady who didn't get enough screen time. She was great, but just didn't really get used all that well, honestly. it never comes up again. And I think like that's like half an hour, 40 minutes into the movie. So another 2 hours later, and they're like, oh yeah, we forgot about it. We get back to New York. He's sitting in his apartment. His ex-wife comes back. No mention of being framed for murder or anything. That annoyed me. And this last criticism, which is going to sound like praise at the start, but it does turn into criticism, is that I think this movie is actually a healthy level of nostalgic for the most part until that last scene. And if you've watched the movie, you know what I'm talking about. And if you haven't watched the movie, spoilers. Like, you're watching this, like, the movie came out 2 years ago. If you give that much of a shit, I was going to say you probably watched it already, but I only watched it a couple of days ago. So that would be hypocritical of me to say. But yeah, I think that a lot of the movie is very healthy about its nostalgia. Like when Sala comes to help out Indy when he needs to get out of New York, and there's that little bit of conversation where he's, mentions that without Indy's help, he and his family wouldn't have been able to immigrate to the US. And just like the little interactions with his kids, and it was just like, yeah, no, this is like a nice little bit of nostalgia that isn't blinding the story. And yeah, there's a couple other moments that I do like throughout the movie, but then that last scene where we have Karen Allen come back through the door, everyone else leaves the room, they have their little where does it hurt moment, and then at this point I'm still like, okay, that was a bit heavy-handed, but sure, I get it. Then the final shot, the very final shot, and I hate it when I really enjoy a movie and then it's the last shot of the movie that fucks it up for me, and that's the case here. So as Sala and Wombat are walking down the street to get ice cream with Sala's kids, and then the camera pans to the fire escape outside of Indy's apartment with the hat hanging on the outside, and then it does the classic, circle mask, and it's just the hat. And then instead of it, the mask closing or it dipping to black from there, they hold on for a second. A hand, supposedly Indy's, grabs the hat. The rest of this movie had felt like such a genuine farewell to the character that last shot felt like it spat in the face of everything else that this movie was going for. But let's talk about some of the positive things about this movie, because like I said, I did overall actually really enjoy this. Definitely more than Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, which go watch that after you've watched this one. So the thing that I really like about this is Jürgen Voller as a character, I think is really good, particularly in this day and age. Despite me feeling a bit nothing about Mikkelsen's performance, like I said, just because he's kind of playing the same bad guy all the time, he is good at this. I think there's a lot of little nods to both like classical Nazi philosophy and neo-Nazi philosophy that we're seeing a lot of rising up today. And I think Mangold did a really good job of touching on that without it being super on the nose. Voller's core philosophy with the Antikythia? Probably saying that wrong. But Archimedes' dial, the dial of destiny, is that it is a not time travel device, but a time travel compass that like will navigate you to a rift in time. And his whole philosophy is that he says this, I think one of the very early in the movie is he says Hitler lost the war.
You didn't win the war. Hitler lost it.
And I think that is a good setup for a character that thinks he can go back in time, kill Hitler, take over Nazi Germany, and win World War II, which is a pretty common neo-Nazi philosophy. The idea that Hitler set up a great foundation, but just failed on the execution. He couldn't stick the landing. And so with, whoever the neo-Nazi in question is, right, their idea is that they would do the Third Reich better. And I think that is an interesting idea to explore with this character, especially when you look at all the other little nods to not just Nazi behavior, but fascist behavior in general. Like when Indy is giving him criticism and just gets backhanded. And it's a very common thing for fascists to silence criticism with violence. And we see that throughout the movie. There's quite a good bit of violence from characters that we don't necessarily know are fascists at that point in the story, but anyway. And I guess that ties into the next part I like about this perspective on Nazis that Mangold's got going on here, where for most of the movie, Waller's goons mostly just seem to be dudes that are like, I was paid to do a job, I will kill people, that's what I'm paid to do. But then later in the movie, once Waller's plan has advanced a bit more, they're about to do the whole time travel shtick, and they rock up to this airbase, and there's this plane that's decked out in Nazi, what's the word for all the painting on planes? And you see his goons, who, one of them's definitely a white American. Can't remember who the other guy was as well, I think so. But both of them go from their relatively plain clothes setup to full-on Nazi regalia, start speaking in German, doing the salutes, all of that. Like, really go for the whole pivot of looking like an ordinary person, and then, you know, when they feel like the time is right, pivoting to full-on Nazis. And again, just a very poignant piece of commentary to be making about Nazism in the current age. I'm just going to show the clip, and you know what I mean. But to foil that, something that I actually really enjoyed in that last sequence of the movie, even though I'm not that big on the time travel bit and the meeting Archimedes bit, didn't love that, but didn't hate it either. But in the Siege of Syracuse, the fact that the Nazi plane gets shot down by the Romans, and if you're not familiar, Hitler in particular, really idealized, romanticized a lot of the Roman Empire, particularly the elite of the Roman Empire. And so I think there's a nice little bit of poetic irony in these Nazis traveling back in time and then being like, oh, A, wrong time, B, we got shot down by Romans. That's a little bit funny. I thought that was pretty good. But also, I really liked Phoebe Waller-Bridge as Wombat. Now, I'm a little bit biased. I really love Fleabag, both the original stage performance and then the 2 seasons of the show. So obviously, I'm going to have a little bit of bias towards her work. I think she's pretty great. But I think that she really pulls off the arrogant young archaeologist that has had this idealized role model in her head for 20 years and no one to correct it. Like, her father basically went insane, and I think it's implied that he killed himself. They weren't super specific about it. They just kind of made it clear he was dead. Yeah, so she's lacked a direct parental role model for a good chunk of her life. The one that she did have was also gone for 20 years. And so she's fixated on this romanticized idea of her role model, and then also projected her own values onto this idealized Indiana Jones because he wasn't around to correct that. And I think that performance was actually quite good. And I like this performance of this, you know, hard-ass, strong, independent, reckless woman that, in the right environment, is shown to have some heart. Like what I mentioned earlier when Indy's talking about, like, hey, like, she tells the story of how she met, I can't remember her sidekick's name because he's kind of very secondary in the movie. Yeah, and so she's telling Indy the story of how they met. He was trying to pickpocket her in Venice, I think it was. Kind of, you know, had a bit of camaraderie going. And Indy points out, it's like, well, clearly not so selfish, because that's not a profit thing. He doesn't make you more money. It's not a business thing. It's you like this kid, you got on well, and then you got a little sidekick. A little bit of a parental attitude towards it. And even she seems a bit caught aback by that. But yeah, there's nice little character moments throughout this movie that I think are all really good. Overall, I don't think the narrative is amazing. I think the story functions. And I think the focus on character works a lot better than the overall narrative does. But honestly, I think this movie's actually pretty good. I really enjoyed it, aside from that last shot that soured all of it. But if you haven't watched it, I would actually recommend going and watching it. It's a good time. But that's where I'm going to leave things. If you haven't watched my video on Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, that's over here. And I watched this movie for a video I was working on the main channel, which is about God. So you can go watch that here. It's a fun one. Anyway, thank you for watching.